The LD at School team is very pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Sarah Terryberry, whose presentation this afternoon is entitled The Road Ahead, the Undergraduate Learning Experience for Students with LDs. The Ministry of Education has provided funding for the production of this webinar. Please note that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education, nor the Learning Disabilities Association. We'll also be tweeting throughout the webinar, so if you'd like to participate, you can join the conversation on Twitter. You can either send us a tweet using our handle at LD at School, which is at the bottom of the screen there, or use the hashtag LD webinar and see all of our tweets. And one more new inclusion in this webinar setup is that we've developed a Padlet for as like a one-stop shop for all our webinars. So I'm just going to show you that really quickly here. This is our Padlet page. I will be sharing the address in the chat to all participants. But here you can see all of our recent webinars, including the one today. And this is where you'll be able to view and download the presentation slides, as well as our additional resource list. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Sarah Terryberry is a course instructor at Brock University in the Department of Teacher Education. She recently completed her PhD at Western University in the area of applied educational psychology, specializing in the area of learning disabilities. Broader teaching and research interests include educational psychology, models of inclusive special education, disability and ability, adolescent learning, and learner development. So welcome, Sarah. The cyber floor is now yours.
Okay, so welcome everybody again and good afternoon, and thank you so much for taking the time to join me today for this webinar. Today's presentation looks at the undergraduate learning experience for students with LD, and specifically some of the real life challenges and issues that students with LD may face as they transition to post-secondary schooling environments. My presentation today is going to be based on my research from my PhD dissertation, and I completed that a couple of years ago now. I became interested in this topic as I witnessed firsthand some students struggling as they entered the university context where I've taught for the past 8 years. The transition to university and other higher education settings is tricky to navigate on its own, even for students without disabilities. But in my teaching experiences, it's become quite evident that this is often even more true for students with disabilities as they face a number of unique challenges. So today, my presentation is going to highlight some of the key differences between the secondary and post-secondary environments and showcase some of the challenges that students with LD may face as they navigate the transition between the two. We're also going to discuss some key strategies to help support students with LD as they move into post-secondary schooling. So just a quick outline of what we'll talk about today. First, I will do a brief overview of learning disabilities, what these look like and mean for the learning context, and implications for the transition to post-secondary education. Next, I'm going to discuss what some of the current research says about students with LD in post-secondary environments. Third, I'll talk about my research and what I discovered about the undergraduate experience of students with LD in these contexts. And last, I'm going to provide an overview of how you can help to prepare students for this transition, including some practical strategies and some key resources that are going to help support that move. So let's begin by talking about some of the concerns you have and some of the challenges that you feel your students or child might encounter in the transition to post-secondary education. So I want to ask you to share via the chat, what types of challenges do you envision your students with LD might face in the transition to post-secondary learning? And feel free to share your ideas using the chat feature. Okay, I see some ideas coming up: organization, time management, knowing how to get the accommodations they had in high school, self-advocacy, not being able to keep up with the workload. Okay, all of these are very, very valid concerns that you might have as either parents or as educators. Getting work started. Self-advocacy, managing workload. Okay, lots of recurring themes here. Okay, excellent suggestions. And these are all, like I said, valid concerns that you have. And research actually shows that students do in fact face many of these challenges as they transition from high school to university or college. So in today's session, you're going to see some of the actual concerns that students themselves have about their post-secondary learning and some real life issues that they're presented with in these environments. We're also going to talk about key strategies to help mitigate these potential challenges for your students. And I hope that you're going to be able to use the information provided to help prepare your students or your children more effectively for the different changes that they're going to encounter. So just in the sake of, for the sake of time, we'll keep moving on here. Let's start the session off first with a brief overview of LD and what this looks like and means for classroom learning and the transition to post-secondary education. So what is LD? Learning disabilities refer to a group of disorders that essentially affect how someone learns. As per the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario, a learning disability affects the acquisition, organization, retention, understanding, or use of verbal or nonverbal information, which results from impairments in one or more psychological processes related to learning. When we think of learning disabilities, we often think of issues related to reading, writing, and/or math. Until recently, LD was often defined and diagnosed in relation to these three broad areas of learning. More recent definitions of LD have been broadened, though, to highlight the overlap between these areas of learning as they impact on academic achievement. So more recent definitions and understandings of LD also place emphasis on broader issues that individuals with LD face, such as problems related to memory or attention, issues with processing speed, executive functioning problems. So for example, things like organizational issues, planning and maintaining attention, which some of you already mentioned, and issues with social skill development and functioning. We know that the nature of LD impacts on the academic achievement of students with LD in specific domains of learning. These include oral language, reading, written language, and mathematics. Because these skills are central to the learning process, we see students with LD struggling to learn across many different subject areas. So essentially, LD is an impairment in information processing. It takes longer for students to take information in, recognize it, understand it, and produce a desirable action. It's not that students with LD are incapable of learning the content that's being taught. In fact, these students usually have average to above average intelligence. It's usually more the case that they simply require more time than other students to do so. Because of these processing challenges, students with LD usually present with either one, unexpected academic achievement, so they may not be meeting the expectations for the specific subject or grade, or two, their academic achievement is at the expected level, but it's only maintained through high levels of effort, support, and/or through the use of different strategies that they've developed over time. So what does this mean for learning and functioning in a learning environment? This really depends on a number of factors, including the student and what their individual strengths and needs are, the environment and the learning demands that are present within this, and the supports that are available to bridge the gap between the two of these things. Research suggests that students with LD transitioning to post-secondary environments often face a variety of academic, social, and emotional challenges as they navigate this change. In terms of academic challenges, it's been shown that students may face issues related to the difficulty with the amount or level of work, organizational problems, and or difficulty with time management and or task focus. In terms of social challenges, students often face issues related to communicating their needs to others or self-advocating for themselves. They may also experience issues with using interpersonal skills and interacting with others, especially their peers and instructors as they transition into this new learning context. In terms of emotional challenges, students may face issues related to low self-esteem, and they may experience issues related to anxiety, stress, and or mental health related challenges because of the transition on its own or because of their disability more specifically. Often students who experience these difficulties require specialized support in order to successfully integrate and succeed in these environments. So let's take a look at what some of the current research tells us about students with LD in post-secondary contexts and what some of the current issues are that they may encounter and what some of the key differences are between secondary and post-secondary environments. Learning disabilities are one of the most prevalent types of disability in Canada. While there are no definitive Canadian statistics, in total it's estimated that as many as about 1 in 10 Canadians have a learning disability. The 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability reports that LD was the second most prevalent type of disability experienced in youth aged 15 to 24 that were surveyed. The most prevalent at this time was mental health related disabilities. In post-secondary environments specifically, we know that with advances in disability policies and practices, more and more students with LD are pursuing post-secondary studies. Though the exact numbers of students with LD in Canadian post-secondary settings are unclear, it's estimated that these students account for approximately 5% or so of any given post-secondary population. In high schools, students with LD are one of the largest populations receiving support services. According to different sources, including data from disability services offices across Ontario post-secondary settings, this is true for post-secondary schools as well. So students with LD attending post-secondary settings represent one of the largest disability-related populations registered for support services. One thing to consider with these numbers is the issue of self-reporting. So because learning disabilities data documentation relies heavily on self-reported measures, the actual number of students with LD in these settings may be even greater when considering those who have chosen not to formally self-identify. Despite the increase in attendance rates of students with LD in higher education, a vast amount of research suggests that post-secondary outcomes for students with LD remain poor in comparison to students without disabilities. In terms of enrollment and retention, research has shown that students with LD continue to be underrepresented in higher education in comparison to students without disabilities. For those that do attend higher education, dropout rates remain high. In terms of academic performance, research has shown that students with LD often demonstrate poorer academic performance than those without because of the nature of the student's LD, their ability to adjust to the social scene of the learning environment, or their ability to adjust to the academic demands of the setting. In terms of the affective and social emotional realms, research shows that individuals with LD often have lower self-esteem, higher anxiety, and poorer interpersonal skills compared to individuals without LD. Research has also shown that students with LD often have heightened perceptions of bias against people with disabilities, which in turn impacts on their desire to seek services and or support at this level. So what are some of the contributing factors to these poor outcomes? Why are these things happening? The first factor is the difference between the environments and how supports are provided in these different settings. So in the K-12 system, for example, all students receive varying levels of support for their learning needs, often regardless of formal diagnosis. This is possible because of smaller environments, better knowledge of individual learners, and the use of strategic instructional practices like UDL and DI, differentiated instruction. For those that are identified, the IEP is designed in school with input from multiple stakeholders, and support is often provided directly by the classroom teacher and other individuals. So this is very much a team-based approach to supporting students. In post-secondary settings, this process is significantly different. Students must request support and accommodation. It isn't automatically transferred or offered, and they must provide appropriate documentation in order to receive this support. The second factor, access to services, connects directly to these differences that I just mentioned. So again, at the secondary level and prior to this, documentation of disability is not necessarily required to receive learning support in all academic realms. At the post-secondary level, however, a formal diagnosis is needed along with up-to-date documentation, which many students don't necessarily have right away. Support at this level is also coordinated and monitored by a third party, often the support services office. And here, students must ask to receive support and accommodation at this level, and it must also be granted. It's not something that is automatically set in place. So self-advocacy and self-determination are key here. The third factor I've noted here relates to frontline support for students, and more specifically to the knowledge and attitudes of faculty and instructors in their ability to provide support to students. Teachers at the secondary level are trained in the teaching profession and have knowledge in the area of meeting the needs of exceptional learners in their classrooms. At the post-secondary level, instructors often don't have specialized knowledge of disability, and many don't have formal teacher training either. Research has shown that some faculty level teachers may be unfamiliar with their legal responsibilities to meet the learning needs of students at this level, and are often unsure how to do this effectively. Research also supports the idea that some teachers at this level hold negative attitudes towards students with disabilities, and the idea of supporting students at this level through individualized accommodation and support. All of these factors have been shown to impact on the successful outcomes of students with LD in post-secondary settings. So let's step back and take a broader look at some of the key differences between the secondary and post-secondary environments to see how all these issues connect. First, in terms of the classroom, we see obvious differences in structure. So at the secondary school level, we have smaller class sizes. Attendance here is also recorded and tracked. At the post-secondary setting, class sizes vary. This is very program dependent. So for example, in my program, we have class sizes maybe around 30 students or so, whereas in perhaps a larger program, you might have larger classes with upwards of 500 to 1,000 students in some of those classes. Attendance here may be recorded, but it may be not recorded as well. So it's really up to the individual student to sort of choose to attend the class. At the secondary school level, again, there's more one-on-one support because of the smaller environment. At the post-secondary level, we have limited one-on-one support, again, probably very program dependent. And when support is available, it's not automatically given. It's usually available by appointment. So if a student needs support right away, they might have to wait for a bit to get that support. At the secondary school level, classes occur on a daily basis. So there's consistency in learning content and also in teaching. At the post-secondary level, classes typically occur maybe once a week or twice a week. It really depends again on the program. And each class may vary anywhere between 2 to 3 hours in length. So again, the content might be chopped up a little bit, and the teaching again may vary depending on the content that's being taught and what they're learning in the class that day. In terms of the teachers, we're also seeing differences in terms of the teachers as well. So differences in terms of teaching structure, practices, and how support's being provided to students. At the secondary school level, teachers, as I mentioned, have specialized knowledge of teaching and learning. At the post-secondary level, instructors do not necessarily have teacher training. They're specialized in their content area that they're teaching, but not necessarily on, they don't specialize in effective teaching practice per se. At the secondary school level, teachers also help to coordinate and implement accommodations for students in need. Accommodations here are offered to students, and students are coached to use these at the secondary and elementary levels even. In the post-secondary setting, accommodations are coordinated by somebody else. They're typically coordinated by the support services office, and then they're executed by the students' instructors in different ways. Students choose to use the accommodations and supports here as well. So they may not opt in to use all of their accommodations. It really is going to depend on their level of comfort and their perceived level of need, depending on, again, the class and the class structure. Third, in terms of the social environment, we see differences in how students learn with and interact with their peers, which in turn impacts on how they engage with the learning environment. So some key differences here at the secondary level: students typically live with their family and they have easy access to immediate support systems when that's needed. Their family is right there and they have somebody typically advocating for them alongside of them. At the post-secondary level, students live in residence or off campus. Many live away from their immediate family and support systems here. So they don't necessarily have that immediate access to their family as they did at the secondary level. Also at the secondary level, we're seeing, again, smaller learning environments. Students have good familiarity with their peers here. They know each other's learning needs. There's consistency in this environment with the people around them. Often we're seeing the same friendships throughout the year here. At the post-secondary level, it's a much, much larger learning environment with many new relationships. So we're seeing different friendships for different classes. And again, that's usually program and situation dependent. So students need to make choices about who they're going to interact with and when and what that looks like. So let's take a look at what my research found about the lived experiences of students with LD in post-secondary settings. We'll talk about some key findings from my study and some important considerations for teaching and learning at both the secondary and post-secondary level. So my research investigated how the needs of students with learning disabilities are currently being met at the post-secondary level. We know that more and more students with LD are pursuing post-secondary studies, but many of them still experience challenges navigating the post-secondary environment and accessing appropriate support for their learning. While some research efforts have been made to investigate these issues, very little information exists around the actual lived experiences of students with LD in post-secondary environments. So my research sought to address these gaps by looking in part at the student experience from the student perspective. My research asked 4 broad research questions related to how students with LD are being supported in the university environment. My focus here was primarily how they were being accommodated in this environment, what those accommodations look like, and what their perception of the support procedure was. A large emphasis in my study was also placed on the role of faculty, since we know the research tells us that faculty play a key role in how supported these students feel. The question on your screen on the slide, what are the specific barriers of access to accommodation and support that students with LD experience in university, and how do they navigate these challenges, was the primary question that probed the direct experience of students in university settings. So this question was explored in two different formats. I used a large scale survey that was sent out by the Support Services Office to students who had a learning disability diagnosis. Students who completed this survey were also asked if they would like to participate in a more personal interview, so I could learn a bit more about their individual perspectives on some of the support procedures. The quantitative survey used was a variation of a newer survey called the Faculty Preparedness Survey, created by Catherine Hansen. I modified this to create a version that focused on student perceptions of faculty preparedness to meet their needs at the post-secondary level. The survey assessed factors of faculty knowledge of learning disabilities and also faculty attitudes towards students with learning disabilities, as you can see in some of the examples of questions that I've displayed on the slide. The qualitative interviews were used to look at the experiences of students with LD in a more personal manner. Questions were based on the main research questions and also issues from the research literature that I found. So I've displayed again some examples of questions that were asked to students as well here on the slide. You can take a look at a few of the questions that I actually asked students in my study. So let's take a look at what some of the findings were from the participants. The first issue that students disclosed related to the in-class learning experience itself. Students reported dealing with a number of challenges within the immediate classroom environment, including learning formats, challenges related to the instructor's teaching style or method of teaching, and issues with assessment structure. In general, almost all students seem to struggle in one way or another with the typical university lecture format. For those who struggled with concentration and processing speed, the length of the lecture, the limited number of breaks, the large class size, and the number of distractions appeared to be the biggest challenges. Additional challenges noted around teaching style included things like the rate at which the professor spoke or gave information, the amount of visual materials used, and the amount of interaction or activity time provided. Assessment structure at the university level also proved to be challenging for many of my participants. For those that had difficulties retaining information, the heavy emphasis placed on formal testing, so typically things like midterm exams and final exams, was a significant challenge for them. Testing time, testing format, and the amount of memorization required to complete tests also appeared to cause a considerable amount of anxiety in these participants. The lack of immediate access to professors or instructors for clarification during these testing times, so for example, if they were writing in a separate room, was also a big cause for concern. Many of the students in my study used different strategies to help manage these issues. To help ease difficulties with the learning format, students suggested that they would read and reread course materials ahead of time. They would print lecture slides and notes ahead of time. They would use note taking to stay focused during lectures. They would record the lectures as needed, and they would sit in specific areas of the classroom to be more accessible to the instructor or to avoid distractions. To help ease the difficulties with assessment, many students emphasized how they really studied prior to the test, placing a really heavy emphasis on that studying component. They made sure to attend workshops to improve on specific study skills and test writing skills. And they also ensured that they had a quiet work or study space. So moving to the library when they needed to, or going to a private room. Other strategies to assist with learning challenges in the classroom included things like attending professor and TA office hours for one-on-one support, seeking outside help for tutoring, and taking a reduced course load where needed. The second significant issue noted by students in this study was the issue of having their needs met by the instructor in the class environment. Overall, it was quite evident that many students had reservations about the amount of LD related knowledge and supportive teaching skills that instructors had at this level. Many participants noted difficulty obtaining appropriate and timely accommodations from their professors as a main challenge. Though it was noted that most instructors willingly provided the accommodations as set out by the support services office. So things like extra exam time, change to location for test writing, the use of technology, things like that. It was generally perceived that instructors were unwilling or unable to go above and beyond what was set out by the support services office. Students tended to attribute this difficulty to either their professor's lack of knowledge of appropriate accommodations and how to implement these, or their lack of understanding of LD. A specific point of concern raised by many students related to instructors' lack of flexibility in supporting them. So I'll give you some examples here. One student, for example, described an instant where a professor refused to share copies of his PowerPoint slides ahead of class. Another student recalled a time where he had requested extra time on a take-home assignment, but his request was refused because of the nature of the assignment. It was already a take-home assignment. Accessing testing accommodations from instructors also proved to be problematic for many students. Two students described instances where they requested testing format modifications but were refused. Another student who was granted the accommodation of extra time by support services recalled a time where she requested her exam time be split over the course of 2 days, but her request was also denied by the professor. So overall, students felt that most of their instructors who weren't flexible in providing supports didn't have the knowledge or the understanding of LD to be able to do so. Seeking in-class support for their learning needs was noted by many of my participants as a third significant issue. Primarily, this appeared to be connected to students' perceptions of their professors' attitudes, their approachability, and their willingness to provide support or accommodations. Many students felt hesitant in voicing their need for accommodation because of their perception of their instructor's personal opinion of individuals with disabilities generally, or because of their perceptions of their instructor's personal opinion about the need for accommodation at the university level. When asked to describe their personal experiences with this, for example, again, one student recalled a time where he made a request for an accommodation and was made to feel as if he was cheating. Along the same lines, another student made the point that he often had the impression from instructors that they felt that he was either lazy or that he wasn't able to apply himself. Another student actually had to seek additional support and assistance from the support services office for accommodations that were already in place for her because her professor refused to execute her accommodations because he didn't believe they were necessary for a certain situation. So most students who recalled experiences such as these also reported feeling discouraged from seeking the support that they needed in the future from professors. So what are the implications of these findings? The first implication is that the classroom experiences of these students with LD in post-secondary education, these experiences are largely dependent on faculty and instructors at this level. Again, this is not surprising given their role in the educating process at this level. Unfortunately, this is very much a systematic issue that needs to be dealt with sort of at that post-secondary level in terms of policy and practice. Some suggestions for improvement here would be faculty training and professional development in the area of teaching students with disabilities broadly, and more specifically in improving the understanding around learning disabilities and effective teaching practices for students with LD. Another recommendation would be something like sensitivity training for faculty, instructors, and those working with students with disabilities generally. It's obvious from the study that negative attitudes around students with disabilities continue to exist in these settings, and we need to work on broadening our understanding of why and how individuals with disabilities can be successful in these environments. The second implication is that students need to be prepared for these realities because this isn't an easy fix and it's something that will take time to work on. So most universities and colleges, in fact, have made these issues a priority in terms of their equity, inclusion, and diversity focused mandates and policies. But what we need to realize again is that these system level changes aren't going to happen overnight. So students need to be prepared for these types of issues at the post-secondary level and know how to manage them. Some key areas here would be to make sure students have knowledge of the accommodation process. So for example, what this looks like at the school and how to access accommodations. They should have knowledge of their rights and their responsibilities, what's required of them to be able to access support, and what's legally required of others in the provision of support. Knowledge of their individual strengths and needs, and how their support should match these, and the ability to self-advocate and seek help at different levels when needed. So let's talk about some of the practical strategies that we can implement in the classroom or in the home environment to support students who are making the transition to post-secondary education. I'd like to turn it back to you for a moment and ask you, what are you currently doing to support your students with LD in preparing for post-secondary education? If you're an educator, maybe you can highlight some strategies that you're using in the classroom to support these students. Or if you're a parent of a child with LD, maybe you can shed some light on what you're currently doing at home to support this transition. Feel free again to drop some ideas in the chat. Okay, so self-advocacy, I'm seeing come up. Daily check-ins. Virtual, asking the school to hold a virtual case conference. That's a good idea. Lots of self-advocacy and self-awareness. Study skills. Okay. Excellent. Again, many great strategies being shared here, good ideas. Many of you are already doing some of the things that I was actually going to suggest that we look at. So again, for the sake of time, we'll just keep moving along. The first practical strategy that I would suggest would be to prepare for the transition by doing some research on different post-secondary settings, sort of generally. This can and should be done with the student or with your child themselves, Have them do their own research on different settings and find out what they like about each setting and what they dislike. Make sure to research what accessibility services are offered at the school, who offers them and how, where the accessibility services are physically located in the school, and how support providers in these offices can be accessed. Also, make sure to research what is needed to be able to access support. So look into the school's requirements for supports to be put in place. Not every school may be the same here. Obtaining documentation can also take some time, so make sure to start working on this as soon as possible. So that's the first one, preparing just sort of generally for the transition. The second piece here, the second strategy, is to familiarize yourself with the different support procedures that will be in place. So make sure that students understand how the support procedures at the school work, who helps to coordinate these, and how they are implemented at the classroom level. Again, at the secondary level, most of these supports come directly from the teacher. But at the post-secondary level, these typically come from the support services office. And this office also regulates and monitors how these are provided in the classroom. Students need to know ahead of time how this process works. The third strategy is making sure students know their rights and their responsibilities in the support process. Again, at the secondary level, supports are often automatically provided based on need. At the post-secondary level, though, these need to be requested, and there can be a bit of a lengthy process in getting these in place. Students need to know that they play an active role in securing appropriate support and determining what this support looks like. If they don't ask for support through the support services office, it likely won't be provided at the classroom level. Students should also be aware of what the legal responsibilities of others are here. So for example, again, what the role of the support services office is and what the responsibilities of classroom instructors are. They need to be aware of who should be doing what if any issues do arise. This ties into the next strategy, building self-advocacy skills, which many of you actually mentioned already. It's important that students have these types of skills at this level, as support is often dependent on students' abilities to voice their needs. Self-advocacy skills have been proven to be essential in seeking accommodation and support services, forming relationships with faculty instructors, and also developing peer support systems. Some of the ways that we might build these skills at the secondary level include fostering greater forms of independence within the classroom or at home, providing opportunities for students to voice their opinions and advocate for their needs, and even things like practicing different scenarios that students may likely encounter at the post-secondary level, using strategies like role play or fictional cases and scenarios. The next strategy relates to strengthening students' learning skills and learning strategies. So working on things like organization, time management, effective study skills, and maintaining focus. At the secondary level, we often teach learning skills and strategies within the structure of our course content. Oftentimes, however, we don't do this in an explicit manner. These skills are learned and practiced regularly, but not in an explicit way. What happens at the university level is that students often don't know how to use these strategies in new situations. They don't know how to apply or adapt the strategies that they've learned to different scenarios. A practical strategy, therefore, would be to work on these types of strategies in a more explicit manner. So using explicit instruction of different strategies and how to apply these or use these in different situations would be first and foremost. Modeling the strategy. So for example, again, how it's used and how it's applied in different situations would be second. And then building these strategies into everyday teaching and the different types of learning opportunities opportunities that you're presenting to students would be third. And this can be done in the home as well, making sure to practice, making sure to model what these strategies look like. The last strategy noted here is to prepare students for the social implications that they're bound to be faced with at the post-secondary level. This presentation focused primarily on students' academic experiences and didn't touch on social implications much until this point. Another finding from my study was that students often faced social challenges as well in their learning experiences, so inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. Many mentioned feeling fearful of meeting new friends, working with other students in class-based group work, and fitting in with the larger crowd. Many participants also mentioned feeling stigmatized by others, especially if they decided to disclose their LD to their peers. So it's important to focus on relationship building at the secondary level and preparing students for the different social situations that they're likely to encounter in this environment. And some of the ways that we might do this would be to offer lots of opportunities to interact with others in the class. So things like groupings that they wouldn't typically go with in a normal situation. Explicitly working on social skills and social skill development if needed, and teaching students how to interact with different groups of people in new ways. Again, you want to model to students and prepare them for what their actual experiences might look like in these new environments. So this last slide here highlights some practical resources that you might find helpful for preparing students for the transition to post-secondary settings. The first resource I've noted here are post-secondary transition programs. Most, if not all, universities and colleges offer transition support programs for incoming students. These may include summer prep type programs that are specific to the transition itself, or they may include year-round programming and support options. It really depends on what the school is offering. So Brock, for example, has a prep program called Smart Start. This is an orientation for all incoming students, but they also have a preparation program specifically for students with LD called the Strategies Program. And this program helps to familiarize students with accessibility services and provides skill-based programming on things like knowing and understanding your LD, your strengths and your weaknesses, building self-advocacy, managing stress and anxiety, and just generally getting familiar with the university culture and different learning environments. It also allows for opportunities to meet staff, faculty, and other students. There are lots of other types of programming services available year-round through the support services offices typically. So things like skill-based workshops and programs that are set up throughout the year, but also things like individualized services, like working one-on-one with a learning strategist when needed. And I would encourage you all, you and your students, to research what programs the different universities and colleges offer as you prepare for that. The second resource I've noted here is the RARC Transition Guide. So RARC, or the Regional Assessment and Resource Center, is an organization out of the Kingston area that provides services to secondary and post-secondary students, and also to adults returning to post-secondary learning. Their immediate focus is on populations in southern and southeastern Ontario and in Kingston, but there are many excellent resources offered to those outside of these communities as well, including the Transition Resource Guide. So the Transition Resource Guide is a website that's available to anyone, and it includes disability-related information about post-secondary education, such as how to access accommodations, when to disclose one's disability, and information about living in residence and getting around campus. It also provides detailed information about every college and university in Ontario, the services they offer, and how to access them. So I've listed the website information there on the slide, and I believe Susanna has probably included this too on the Padlet that has resources in it. The third resource I have listed is provincial and community-based supports. So this includes resources like the Learning Disabilities Association and their affiliated local chapters. The LDA provides advocacy for individuals with LD through information resources and by building awareness at a broader level. They also offer different forms of support and services like workshops for individuals with LD, educators, and parents. Local chapters offer smaller scale programming. So for example, in Niagara, the Niagara LDA recently started a program called SOAR for students in grades 7 and 8 transitioning to high school, and also students in grade 11 and 12 transitioning to college or university. The program here is for students and their caregivers and aims to support these individuals by equipping them with necessary skills for these new learning contexts. So things that would be sort of taught and mentioned in these courses, things like learning strategies, self-advocacy, building self-advocacy skills, building strong approaches to mental well-being, things like that. Again, I would encourage you to take a look at what your local LDA has to offer in your specific area. So this brings us to the final slide and some final conclusions. In our session today, we talked a lot about what the student experience for students with LD could potentially look like at the post-secondary level. Hopefully from this, you've gained some insight into how to help prepare your students for this transition in a meaningful way. Some important points to take away from this presentation. First, students with LD can be and are successful at the post-secondary level. They might face some unique challenges along the way, but know that with the right supports in place, students with LD can be successful in these environments. Second, preparation for the transition to university or college and for learning in those environments should begin quite early. If you haven't started already, now is the time to begin thinking about this. The more you help your students prepare for this in advance, the easier it's going to be to navigate that change when it comes to be that time. My third point is that practical preparation for this transition will prepare your students for much more than post-secondary education. So with the proper efforts in place, again, you can help prepare them for living and learning beyond the post-secondary realm as well. Students need many of the skills that we discussed today for successful learning, but they'll also need them for success later in life as well. So again, begin these efforts and the preparation pieces early. Once again, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today for this webinar. Hopefully you've taken away some ideas to help prepare your students and your children for successful post-secondary learning experiences. Thank you also to Susanna and the team at LD at School for inviting me to host this webinar. If you do have any questions, I can take a few of them now, and I've also noted my email on the slide if you'd like to connect after the webinar. So again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a super informative presentation, and I'm sure that our audience has lots of questions. So I'm just going to remind them now that you can use the Q&A box to send your questions through, and I will read them out to Sarah as we go. But just to begin with, I'm going to start with my own questions that have been bubbling to the surface. I sort of saw two portions of the issues that students with LDs are having at the post-secondary level. There's sort of the stuff that's in their control, like their self-advocacy skills and their study skills. And then there's this big portion that's very much out of their control, their teacher and instructor attitudes. And do you feel like, because you are at that level of teaching, that you've noticed attitudes are changing, or is it still sort of slow going?
So in my own experiences, so I work in a faculty of education, and I would suggest that people who work in a faculty of education who have knowledge of teaching and teaching practices are perhaps more accepting and more knowledgeable of these things than perhaps um, some other instructors and professors at different levels. I would definitely say that attitudes are changing, they're evolving. We're seeing, as I mentioned, a lot more students with LD coming into the university context. It's not uncommon anymore. And people are definitely more knowledgeable about that. And I would say more accepting for sure.
All right, well, let's go to a second question here. In your experience, do TAs ever provide extra support for students with LDs?
I would say TAs are probably one of the best supports that could be provided at the university and or college level. That's actually how I came to know some of the challenges of what some students were experiencing. And so was when I started out as a TA and I was helping one student in particular who wasn't able to get the documentation in place to be able to receive formal supports. So I think your TAs are probably the first point of well, depending on your class, the first point of contact, the more accessible point of contact usually, because you see your TAs in smaller settings. So going to them for support is definitely always a great thing to do for sure. But also being sure to go to your instructor and as well if you feel comfortable doing so.
All right.
Thank you so much. So another question. What is the best advice you could pass on to parents who have students that are sort of ending their high school journey at this point?
Best advice. Again, I think it comes back to the idea of preparing your children for that transition and not just thinking about academic preparation, right? Of course, you have to think about things like learning skills and strategies and things like that, and definitely making sure to reinforce them and to sort of work on them even over the summer before moving into the university realm. But preparing them as a parent, preparing them emotionally for this transition as well. Often we tend to forget about that piece, I think, when we're worried about whether or not our child or our student is going to succeed at school. But we can't forget about that emotional piece too. And so just really starting out early, talking to them about what the transition is going to look like, how their schooling is going to be different, what it's going to mean in terms of social situations and things like that, and really just having those conversations. And I think another big piece for parents is really encouraging your child to get involved with things like the transition programs, the summer prep type programs. Many students wouldn't, I could see why they wouldn't want to participate in something like that. They wouldn't want to be singled out as somebody who may be different. But those programs and those supports provide lots of different opportunities to become more familiar with the university culture and to meet some key people that they'll probably be good friends with throughout the year. So it's a really great starting point for a lot of people.
Wonderful, thank you. And we are running a little bit over time, but I don't want to end before answering a question about formal assessments and documentation of learning disabilities, because that is always an area, I'd say a major pain point for both our students, their families. So how recently does this assessment need to be done? And are there any ways to get extra funding to pay for this extra documentation?
I believe there are funding sources out there. I think there might be one through OSAP. This is not an area that I'm overly familiar with. I think OSAP might have some funding available. Different bursaries might be available too through the different schools. But definitely there is some government money, I believe, some through OSAP. And documentation, again, not something because they change these things regularly. I can't answer that with an
I
accurate
believe
result right now.
most recently I've heard between the last 3 to 5 years is sort of the window, and it can vary from institution to institution. So
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, 3 years or so was what I was gonna say.
Yeah, so it really depends. It's very important to know where you want to apply and the rules for application processes at each of those locations. But I
Yeah.
do know that the RARC does offer some discounted or free assessments as well if you are in the Kingston area. And there are ways to be reimbursed for those costs.
Okay, excellent.
So at this point, I think that's all we really have time for today. And I will just share a last few slides with you guys. Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been a wonderful presentation, and thank you for answering our very pressing questions. But if you didn't get your question answered today, there are still ways to get them answered. You can email us at info@ld@school.ca. You can find us on Twitter, either our handle @ld@school or using the hashtag #LDwebinar. You'll find us there. And we do endeavor to get every question answered. So if it's on your mind, let us know. And just before we say goodbye today, I did want to draw some attention to some of the additional resources we have. So one of them is, let's see this one. There we go. So on our Padlet, we do have this document here, which is our additional resource list. And as Sarah mentioned, we do have links to the RARC, to SOAR, which is the LDAO program that transitions, and here's the transition resource guide as well. Those are all really, really helpful resources to have on hand. And then I did also want to bring to your attention some of the learning modules that we have at LD@School, particularly the two most recent ones. Fostering advocacy for students with LDs, which has been quite the topic today. And this is a really in-depth look at self-advocacy skills and how to develop them in a really explicit manner. And then our most recent learning module, which is helping students with LDs navigate secondary school, which has a large portion on transitioning both into and out of secondary school, and helps you sort of put together all the things you need to do to transition onto that next step of post-secondary, if that's what you choose to do. So again, I want to thank you all for being here today. I know it takes a time out of your afternoon, but thank you so much for joining us. Please remember that we will be sending out the presentation slides, our additional resource list, and a link to a feedback survey that will come out tomorrow morning. You'll get an email. And the feedback we receive through the survey provides us with really important information for producing future webinars. So if you are able to complete it, it would be really, really helpful. Thank you again for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.